And now, your daily dose of debate, breaking news, and uncensored views. This is the Michael Medved Show.
And another great day in this greatest nation on God's green earth. A great day when there are reports that there is a new effort to bring the United States and the government of Iran closer together. A second round of negotiations between the U.S. and Iran is under active discussion, according to CNBC, though nothing has been officially scheduled as yet, a White House official said, unidentified White House official. The New York Times reports that the blockade has begun. We all know how it begins. We don't know how it ends. A U.S. blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is now in effect, adding pressure on Iran to strike a deal to end the war between the two countries. There is a report from Max Boot for the Council on Foreign Relations that this could lead to a major naval war. Now, how would that be? President Trump has said we have destroyed the Iranian Navy. And that's true. But they have a separate navy, which belongs to the Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran, and that has small boats and drones and equipment that can cause a world of trouble and perhaps even a big major naval confrontation with the 15 U.S. Navy ships that are already in the region. The New York Times is reporting that the blockade at the Strait of Hormuz is now in effect, adding pressure on Iran to strike a deal to end the war. President Trump said Iranian representatives called U.S. officials yesterday, just as the blockade went into effect, hoping to make a deal. That comes after 21 hours of talks in Islamabad, Pakistan, on Saturday. Those 21 hours failed to reach any breakthrough, though it did produce that truly perplexing metaphor, analogy by J.D. Vance, who led the U.S. delegation, comparing the government of Iran to his wife, Usha, which I'm not sure she appreciated. But in any event, talking about her jumping off of an airplane and promising not to jump off an airplane, which should be enough. Okay, we have been called this morning by the right people, the appropriate people, and they want to work to do they would like to work, said President Trump. I'm not sure what he means. I think he was talking about the right people in Iran who could reach some kind of an agreement to bring the war to a satisfactory conclusion. But how serious any potential return to the negotiating table might be remains completely uncertain. Multiple outlets reported the U.S. In Islamabad proposed that Iran halt its nuclear program for 20 years. Iran has offered to suspend nuclear activity for up to 5 years, which the U.S. has rejected. So we are now talking about the substantial difference between 20 years and 5 years. Meanwhile, the first round of negotiations in Islamabad ended without a deal in hand. President Donald Trump responded to the scrap talks by announcing a blockade of some shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, the vital trade route that typically carries 20% of the world's oil. Several ships linked to Iran, including a Chinese vessel that is linked to Iran. Those ships are already coursing through the Strait of Hormuz, according to reports today, a day after President Donald Trump imposed that blockade on the strategic oil pipeline. Two ships, Christiana and Elpis, are their names. They sound like names for reindeer at a different time of year, but who knows? The ships are called Christiana and Elpis. They stopped at Iranian ports in defiance of the blockade, the New York Post reported, citing marine traffic data. Two other ships, the tankers Rich Starry and Merlikishan, passed through the strait overnight, according to the New York Post, adding that the Rich Starry is owned by a Chinese shipping company. And NPR is reporting another world-changing possibility, a national effort to circumvent the Electoral College has gained another state, Virginia. The new governor of Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, signed a bill yesterday that adds the state to the National Popular Vote Compact, an agreement among states to award their presidential electoral counts to the nationwide popular vote winner. In other words, in elections like the election of 2016, where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. She won the popular vote by a margin of about 3 million votes. And in that election, if this electoral vote compact had its way, she would have become the president, because there are a range of states, a total number of states of 18 of them so far, that have signed an agreement that says that even if we have somebody who wins in our state, if that person hasn't won the popular vote nationally, our votes, electoral votes, would go to the other side. So it would nullify the impact of the Electoral College. It would mean that whoever won the popular vote, whether it was Republican or Democrat, that person would become the new president. With Virginia added, the total number of states signed on to the Interstate Electoral Vote Compact is now 18, plus the District of Columbia, for a total of 222 electoral votes. The compact doesn't go into effect, though, until there are enough states signed up to reach the required 270 electoral votes. But they've got 222 already. That's getting close. According to the Pew Research Center, a majority of Americans say they would prefer the winner of the presidential election to be determined by popular vote, not the Electoral College. So will this go anywhere before the next presidential election, some 2.5 years from now? Who knows? But it is another element not certain at all. We are going to be talking later to the very estimable Pete Wehner, who is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum. His books include The Death of Politics, How to Heal Our Frayed Republic After Trump, City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era, which is particularly timely right now with all of the arguments back and forth about whether the president was justified in basically being so very critical of Pope Leo and saying that the Pope of the Catholic Church is actually soft on crime. There is a new and trending piece in The Atlantic and a new piece by Pete Wehner, who is going to be our guest. He has been an aide in the past to 3 different presidents. His new and trending piece in The Atlantic is called Hegseth's Unholy War. The defense secretary seems less interested in being on the side of God than he is on insisting that God is on his side. We will get to that and more coming up.
Sign up today for our free weekly newsletter at michaelmedved.com.
And on the Michael Medved Show, one of the questions on the table is what is going to happen with the completing blockades, a blockade by the U.S. Navy and our 15 ships, and a blockade by what is left of the Iranian Navy, which apparently is more than has been reported. The cost of all this to the world economy is staggering and uncertain. And in fact, there is a new bulletin reported on CNBC after the first 6 days of war. And of course, now we're way beyond the first month. The first 6 days of the war in Iran racked up costs to the United States and to the U.S. taxpayers of $11.3 billion, according to the Pentagon. But a prominent academic, Professor Linda Bilmes, says that is much too low. It is actually a much higher cost. She believes the total cost, even if the war were to end very quickly in the next few days, the total cost would reach $1 trillion. That is, and that will at least be reached over the next decade if the war continues. Such outlays would exacerbate painfully the proliferating U.S. fiscal deficit, says Linda Bilmes on CNBC. Meanwhile, some bad news in terms of the alliance partners or potential alliance partners of the United States regarding this blockade and regarding the Straits of Hormuz. Both the UK, the United Kingdom, and the French governments have for now formally declined to participate or to assist the U.S. in implementing the Trump's blockade. The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the French President Emmanuel Macron said in separate statements that they would jointly host countries separate from the warring parties. In other words, these would be countries that do not include Iran or the United States. They would come to a European summit this week in which they would aim to develop a coordinated, independent, multinational plan to ensure safe commercial passage across the Strait of Hormuz. And meanwhile, there is a question raised about the enforceability of this blockade and the naval consequences. This is a piece by Max Boot, prepared for the Council on Foreign Relations and published by them. Max Boot is the Jean J. Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow for National Security Fellows at the Council on Foreign Relations. And he points out that the U.S. Navy, with 15 warships in the area of Iran, has the capabilities to enforce a blockade. But the entire region could be in peril if Iran decides to treat the blockade as an act of war, which it is, according to international law. And if Iran starts to fight back against the blockade, it could have very serious consequences. Trump boasts that Iran's navy is completely obliterated, but that's similar to the prior boasts that we had obliterated their nuclear capacity entirely in the military activity, the attack last June. But he is talking about, when he talks about the Iranian Navy being obliterated, he's talking about their regular Navy. According to CNN, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps retains roughly half of its fleet of small, fast attack boats. Iran also has retained half of its missile launchers and thousands of drones. The U.S. Navy appears to be enforcing the blockade not in the Strait of Hormuz itself, which is only 21 miles wide, but to the east in the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. That reduces the risk somewhat of Iranian attacks against the U.S. Navy. But even if Iran does not hit back with military force, writes Max Boot, Trump is still running a substantial gamble, namely that Iran has a lower economic pain threshold than the United States does. In other words, he is hoping that Iran will suffer enough economic damage from the blockade that it will agree to end the war on U.S. terms before the global energy crisis forces the United States and the Trump administration to pull back with their blockade. Yet Iran is a dictatorship, writes Max Boot, that has shown it can withstand years and years of harsh sanctions and brutally repress popular protests when they arise. The United States is a democracy where the rising price of gasoline is raising inflation and sabotaging the Republican Party's chances in the upcoming midterm election. The Iran war is already highly unpopular with American voters, writes Max Boot. So how long can Trump keep exacerbating the energy crisis before being forced to execute a U-turn? He could relax his demands on Iran, for example, by allowing Iran to continue a small amount of enrichment under international monitoring, or simply announce, as he has done in the past, that the Strait of Hormuz is someone else's problem. Say that, okay, with the French and the British get together with a new summit conference from which the United States is excluded, let them deal with opening up the passage for oil in the Strait of Hormuz, because that's what they want to do. But while with their competing blockades, the Iran and the United States are engaged in a high-stakes standoff to see which side blinks first. Max Boot says, I wouldn't bet against Iran, partially because they are able to impose suffering on their own people almost without limit. That is not the case, emphatically, in the United States. Does it matter that the administration is now emphasizing that God is on our side? Particularly a theme for Pete Hegseth. We will get to that question. And the war against the Pope, really? That and more coming up on the Medved Show. And Vice President J.D. Vance, fresh from his 21 hours of failed negotiations with some 70 delegates representing what remains of the government of Iran. Vice President J.D. Vance accused Iran of economic terrorism for effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz, while defending the new U.S. blockade of Iranian ports as an equal response. Analysts warn that the disruption of the key waterway could drive oil and gas prices even higher in the coming weeks. The national average gas price currently stands at $4.12 per gallon. That, according to the AAA. Now, again, the $4.12 per gallon isn't as steep and as difficult as it may be. A member of my family recently was forced to pay. Well, they weren't forced to buy gas, but you need to power your car and sustain your mobility. But gas was as high as $5.85 here in Washington State. The national gas price average is currently $4.12 per gallon. How much higher will it go? And will this be a matter of great regional difference? Who knows? But meanwhile, J.D. Vance, after his return from Pakistan and his embarrassingly inept and totally failed campaign trip to Hungary, where he was trying to support Viktor Orban, the now outgoing prime minister of Hungary, who lost in a crushing landslide. He lost by a ratio of almost 3-1. So this was not a tight race. But he spoke with Bret Baier over at Fox, the vice president, about his advice to President Trump regarding the next steps in Iran. Here is the vice president, clip 15.
My advice to the President of the United States, and we all do, and I expect that when I give advice to the President of the United States, that it's going to be private, because the president should rely on his senior advisors without them then running to the media. What I will say, Brett, is that I 100% agree with the president on the fact that Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. I've seen that just in the negotiation that we've had over the last couple of days, that these are tough negotiators, but they're fundamentally the kinds of people where them having a nuclear weapon would impose terrible costs on the entire world. If they're willing to engage in economic terrorism on the entire world, what would it mean? What leverage would they have if they had a nuclear bomb in Tehran? That's not an outcome that is acceptable to us, or really should be acceptable to anybody. So I 100% support the president's goals here to keep nuclear weapons, to keep the worst weapons of war out of the hands of the Iranians.
Okay, well, that's fairly clear. By the way, you'll notice that he makes a point of saying that he wants to keep his conversations with the president private. It's too bad the president doesn't have those same priorities. President Trump rarely keeps anything quiet. He is constantly posting on Truth Social about anything on his mind, like his post in the last 24 hours about building a hotel on the surface of the moon. He wants a little bit of the glory of the recent Artemis successful moonshot shot around the moon, which is a preparation for people Americans, and maybe a random Canadian here and there, to actually walk again on the lunar surface, or at least to go back to the sound stage where they staged the original moon landing in 1969, which, by the way, people who believe that landing didn't occur, and probably also do believe that this recent epic and very successful NASA project was also a fraud, which it emphatically was not. Concerning J.D. Vance, he makes a point that in the negotiations with the Iranian delegation, the Americans, led by Vice President Vance, put a lot on the table. This is clip 14.
Question that would be best put to the Iranians, because the ball really is in their court. We've made clear where we're willing, again, to be accommodating, and we've made clear where we absolutely need to see the nuclear material come out of the country of Iran. Now, what's interesting, Brett, about this is that in the process of doing this negotiation, I do think that we acquired some knowledge about how the Iranians are negotiating, and this is ultimately why we left Pakistan, because what we figured out is that they were unable, I think the team that was there was unable to cut a deal, and they had to go back to Tehran, either from the supreme leader or somebody else, and actually get approval to the terms that we had set. So again, whether we have further conversations, whether we ultimately get to a deal, I really think the ball is in the Iranian court, because we put a lot on the table. We actually made very clear what our red lines were. We also made clear, Brett, that we actually would be very happy. The President of the United States has said he would be very happy if Iran was treated like a normal country, if it had a normal economy, if its people were able to prosper and thrive. But in order for Iran to be a normal country economically, it's going to have to be a normal country from the perspective of not pursuing a nuclear weapon, and it's going to have to be a normal country from not pursuing terrorism. And so there really is, I think, a grand deal to be had here, but it's up to the Iranians, I think, to take the next step.
Okay, put the ball in the court of the rival. What about the enriched uranium, which they already hold, which is very dangerous? Because with that enriched uranium, if they do have it in the quantities that the Americans report that they do, they have enough to make 11 different nuclear bombs. And they could do that fairly quickly. That is the whole basis for why we attacked when we did. And J.D. Vance said that he was speaking for the administration with his demands and expectations concerning that enriched uranium. This is clip 13.
Well, what are the red lines, like, for Iran, and what didn't they accept? Why are we at the place we're at now?
Yeah, so back out just a little bit, Brett. What the President of the United States has said is, number one, Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. So all of our red lines flow from that fundamental premise, because it is one thing for the Iranians to say that they themselves are never going to have a nuclear weapon. They are willing to say that, and that's good. But you have to, of course, verify these things. And there are two things in particular where the President of the United States really said we have no flexibility. We have to get to the outcome that the President said. On the first of those things, what some people call the dust, which is the enriched uranium that the Iranians currently possess, we have said that we want that to come out of their country, and we would like to take possession of it. Now, why does that matter? That doesn't matter, of course, because they have access to that material now. That material is actually buried underground by Operation Midnight Hammer. But if you think about this over the long haul, the president doesn't want to leave the next president or the president after that to be worrying about this program. And so we would like to get that material out of the country completely so that the United States has control of it.
Except there basically has been reports now that the United States has offered to make an agreement with Iran if they gave up their nuclear program for the next 5 years. That seems to contradict what J.D. Vance is talking about.
The Michael Medved Show.
Listen.
Nationwide.
Listen.
And around the world at michaelmedved.com.
And listen.
And because we are in the midst of a war, and yes, it is a war, it's not just a military action, and it's a war that could go on for weeks, it could go on for months. Some people are suggesting that it could go on in one form or another for years. Let us hope and pray not. But meanwhile, the idea of a war is it focuses attention almost entirely on one branch of government, the executive branch, because that's the branch that is responsible for the military. The president is, by the Constitution, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces who makes the key decisions about war and peace. But meanwhile, there's another kind of war going on in Congress that is embarrassing, and it is proven to be costly with two big new casualties. The most spectacular of those casualties involved Eric Swalwell, who is a Democrat. He is a Democrat who became very well known for his very aggressive criticism and attacks on President Trump during his previous term as president, when he was impeached twice by the House of Representatives. And Eric Swalwell was very much part of that process. He is now resigning from Congress. He hasn't announced yet when exactly he is giving up his post, but it's obviously going to be sometime soon. He has already withdrawn from his candidacy for the governor of California, where he was, according to some polls, running as the front runner of all of the 10 major candidates. He was the front runner. He is now gone. And so is balancing the very closely divided House of Representatives another member of the House, Tony Gonzalez, who is a Republican from Texas. And both of them resigning from the House though the timing of those resignations is unclear. They will not be back. They will not be running for re-election. Tony Gonzalez and Eric Swalwell, both for sexual misbehavior involving members of their staff. The Monday evening, there was an non-resistible, and very potent group of people on both sides of the aisle. People like Anna Paulina Luna, the Republican from Florida, and a number of Democrats as well, demanding the resignation of these two members of the House. Swalwell's announcement came first, completing his stunning fall, the Hill reports, from arguable front-runner status in the California gubernatorial race to being pushed out of his job in the House of Representatives. That all occurred within days. The charges against him involved 4 different women who have now come forward with allegations of sexual misconduct. Those allegations, most disturbingly, include what could be considered rape and may be prosecuted as rape at some point, because one of the victims, the primary victim here, who talks about 2 incidents within years of one another while she was working in the office for Congressman Swalwell. She says at a party or a celebration, she became so inebriated that she didn't know what was happening to her and she couldn't give consent, and he forcibly had sex with her. He has maintained his innocence in the face of those 4 women. He said in part of his statement, "I am deeply sorry to my family," yes, he is married, "my staff, and my constituents for mistakes in judgment I've made in my past." Now, when you say mistakes in judgment, isn't that a little bit misleading given what we're talking about, which is a pattern of low-life activity here? The idea that he says, "I will fight the serious false allegation," he says singular, "made against me. However, I must take responsibility and ownership for the mistakes I did make." This is a failing of character that is beyond the lapse in judgment, wouldn't you say? And meanwhile, for Tony Gonzalez, in some ways it was even worse, because he allegedly used his position as a boss to pressure a member of his staff into sex with him. And also, by the way, one of the charges against Eric Swalwell is that he sent photographs of his private parts to various women who didn't welcome those gifts and were offended by them and oppressed by them and abused by them. And but with Tony Gonzalez, the victim of his attentions, ended up committing suicide by burning her to death in front of her own 8-year-old son. It's a horrible story. And that Republican is also going to be leaving Congress. Ro Khanna talked about the handling of this Eric Swalwell situation by his fellow Democrats in the House. Ro Khanna, another congressman, Democrat from California. Here were his comments and his contrasts.
The allegations are so disturbing. They're so shocking. He needed to resign. I mean, I can't in good faith be talking about survivors of the Epstein class and calling for accountability, and then not a call for accountability of members of Congress. But here is what we need to remember. When Democrats have this type of an issue, we call immediately for resignations and accountability. How about the fact that we have a president of the United States who has engaged allegedly in sexual assault repeatedly, and no one is calling for accountability there? How about all of these powerful and rich men who raped underage girls with the Epstein files, and no one is calling for accountability there? So yes, let's have accountability for Eric Swalwell, but let's not let off the hook the president or other people in those Epstein files. It needs to be accountability for everyone who abuses the law.
There has been a record like this. Jeremy Steiner, Pride of Hillsdale College, does not have a record like this, but he brings up a relevant case. A few years ago, you may remember a senator, not a member of the House, but one of the 100 members of the U.S. Senate, was Al Franken from Minnesota, the former comedian, writer, and somebody who had his own dreams of presidential glory, which he entertained publicly. But Al Franken had been on a trip to Afghanistan to help entertain troops there. And during the trip, there was a model actress who was along, also providing entertainment for troops. And he had pictures taken of himself hovering over her and hovering over her chest in particular while she was asleep. And that was the end of his Senate career. You may remember it was not a suicidal or alcohol-soaked rape or sexual abuse charge in the same sense, but at the beginning of the hashtag #MeToo sensitivity, it led to the end of Al Franken's political career. You may remember he had gotten elected in one of those incredibly close races against Norm Coleman, who was the former incumbent. And you may remember that took numerous recounts before Franken actually won that Senate seat that he lost so ignominiously. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance actually took the initiative to try to explain the controversy about President Trump's posting an image of himself as Jesus and Jesus performing acts of healing. We will get to that and more coming up in This Greatest Nation on God's Green Earth.